Year of college, there was a little country church in Waller, Texas. It was about 50 miles from where Melissa and I were living, and they were without a preacher. And so we would drive up early on Sunday morning, and I would preach that morning, and we'd stay the afternoon with one of the families, and I'd preach that night, and then we'd go home. And we always ate with one of the older couples of the church, Brother and Sister Lawrence Koenig, and Sister Jean would fill the table with all kinds of good food that I've had in your company this week. And Brother Lawrence was the patriarch. He sat at the head of the table. And every Sunday afternoon, without fail, after we finished lunch, he would lean back in his chair and he'd put his hands on his full stomach, and he would say, "That was so good, I wish we were just starting." Well, I want you to know, I wish we were just starting our time together this week. As Bruce said, it's gone by quickly from my perspective, and what a wonderful way you have welcomed me in your midst. I thank you, and I've anticipated this time since Alan first contacted me about coming, and so thankful and so glad to have been with you. It's been good for me to be with Bruce this week. I've enjoyed him and his company. If I had to pick somebody in the Bible that I think he's most like, it would be Abraham, because every time I rode with him, he went out not knowing where he was going. And but probably the most discouraging thing I learned this week is that he and I are the same age, and I don't think I can do what he does. The way not only he excels as a gospel preacher, but as a debater, and just known among our brethren as a scholar of the Word. And what a treasure you have, and I hope you thank God that you have him and his family working here, and you're appreciative of them and all they do in the kingdom. And I hope you thank God for your shepherds and their wives who love you and want you to go to heaven and are leading you toward the chief shepherd, Jesus Christ. And so what a treasure you have in your church family here. I appreciate the way you've taken care of my good friend Jacob Merrick and made him part of your family here. He speaks very highly of you, and I'm glad I finally got to see that face to face. Brother Lawrence Koenig died first, and then Sister Jean followed him not long after. And I was thinking at their funerals that when we've been in heaven for 10,000 years, we'll just be getting started. And I look forward to that great reunion, and I look forward to being with you there. I want to read one final passage in Joshua, the 14th chapter, and I want to invite you to turn there and read with me in your Bible from the Word of God. Joshua chapter 14 is where we'll find the phrase that you see for the sermon title tonight. Joshua chapter 14, we're going to start reading at verse 6. Then the sons of Judah drew near to Joshua in Gilgal, and Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite said to him, "You know the word which the Lord spoke to Moses, the man of God, concerning you and me in Kadesh Barnea. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought back to him as it was in my heart. Nevertheless, my brethren who went up with me made the heart of the people melt with fear, but I followed the Lord my God fully. So Moses swore on that day, saying, Surely the land on which your foot has trodden shall be an inheritance to you and to your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God fully. And now, behold, the Lord has let me live just as he spoke these 45 years from the time that the Lord spoke this word to Moses when Israel walked in the wilderness. And now, behold, I am 85 years old today. I am still as strong today as I was in the day Moses sent me. As my strength was then, so my strength is now, for war and for going out and coming in. Now then, give me this hill country about which the Lord spoke on that day, for you heard on that day that Anakim were there with great fortified cities. Perhaps the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out as the Lord has spoken. If I were to ask you tonight to name the 2 good spies, the 2 out of 12 who came back with the favorable report, where 10 of them said the land is too strong, the people are too large, the city's too fortified, we cannot inherit this land, and 2 spies said, with the power of God, we can do exactly as he said. If I asked you to name those 2, you would likely say them in this order: Joshua and Caleb. And I suppose there's good reason for that. Joshua became the next leader of the Israelites after Moses died. He was the great general who led the conquest into Canaan. He has a book of the Old Testament named after him. And so he overshadows his fellow spy, Caleb. But did you know there is something that is said about Caleb 6 times in the Old Testament? 6 times this phrase is used for this one character. It's kind of like Abraham, who's called the friend of God. He's the only Bible character who's given that description. That doesn't mean that he was the only friend God had, but that Abraham exemplified what God wanted in those he called his friends. David, the man after God's own heart, only person called that in the Bible. Well, Caleb gets this description: he followed the Lord fully. Well, what does that mean? Not he followed the Lord. He followed the Lord fully. Why would it say it that way? We know what it means that our phones are fully charged. We know what it means to be fully dressed and fully grown. We know what it means that the Death Star was fully operational. But what does it mean that that's the second Star Wars joke that went bomb. I'm not going to do any more. What does it mean that he followed the Lord fully? And perhaps more important than that, how can I follow him who followed the Lord fully? Well, would you notice with me tonight 3 things that we learn about Caleb, and 3 things that will help us not just to follow the Lord, but to follow him fully. It's going to take, number 1, vision. It's going to take, number 2, devotion. And number 3, it takes completion. Would you notice those 3 things about Caleb? Caleb was able to see things from a different perspective. He had a different vision that allowed him to follow the Lord fully. Now remember, there were 12 spies who went into the land. They came right onto the verge of Canaan, and they elected 1 man from each tribe who would go in and spy out the land for 40 days. And all 12 spies saw the same thing. They came back and they didn't disagree about what they saw. In fact, when we go back to Numbers chapter 13, we get a glimpse of their report as after 40 days they come back to Joshua and the congregation of Israel. And they tell them about the things that they saw. Verse 25 of Numbers 13. When they returned from spying out the land at the end of 40 days, they proceeded to come to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the sons of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. And they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. One of the best ways I ever saw this illustrated in a kid's Bible class was a teacher blew up some purple balloons and tied it to a broomstick. And she had the kids carry around this as it was the fruit of the land. That's how they had to carry back the cluster of grapes to show people this is what is over there. It truly is a land flowing with milk and honey. Verse 27, we went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is the fruit. Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Amalek is living in the land of the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites are living in the hill country, and the Canaanites are living by the sea and by the side of the Jordan. See, all of the good things were overshadowed by the size of the people. They're huge, they're giants. And their cities are fortified, and they're too strong for us. There's no way we can be successful if we cross over into this land. They'll destroy us. And did you notice who the spokesman for the minority is in the very next verse? Verse 30, then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, we should by all means go up and take possession of it, for we shall surely overcome it. But the people who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are too strong for us. So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone and spying it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size. And look at the last phrase of verse 33, we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. Notice that Caleb didn't discredit what they had seen. He didn't come along and say, well, they're not that big. And the cities aren't that fortified, and the walls aren't that tall. He said, yes, it's exactly as they have described. But there's one thing we have that they don't have. With the help of God, we shall surely overcome it, because He's already promised it to us. Caleb was able to see things with a different vision. I remember when the kids were younger, we took them to the Houston Zoo, and there was at that time a new orangutan exhibit. And so everybody went there first. And so we took the kids over to see the new orangutan. David was still in a stroller, and so I was able to get him all the way up to the front where he could see into the exhibit. And I was watching him, and everybody around us were watching him, and everything he did, the crowd would ooh and ah, and I even heard David go, wow. And I looked down, and he was watching a squirrel go run over here. Didn't even look at the orangutan. We've got to start seeing things not from the ground up, but from God's throne down. We've got to see things from heaven. And the problems that seem so oppressive to us, and the storms that seem so strong, and the difficulties insurmountable. God sees them if they're a little squirrel just running around. They're nothing to Him. You want to follow the Lord fully? Then change your vision. Start seeing like God. Vision involves seeing that which is unseen. Remember when Peter was walking on the water and coming toward Jesus? In Matthew 14 it says, "But seeing the wind," he lost his vision. And in seeing the wind, he couldn't see how powerful Jesus was. You think it's impossible for you to make your marriage work as it is? Then you better change your vision. You think it's impossible for you to be a Christian in your environment, where you go to school or where you work? Then you better change your vision and stop looking at things from your perspective, but start seeing how insignificant those things are in the sight of God. We shall surely overcome it. Even when the Israelites, it said, picked up stones to throw at Joshua and Caleb to get them to be quiet, they still didn't change what they were looking at. It's what enabled them to follow the Lord fully. It requires vision. After Jesus taught the apostles, they said, "Well, Lord, that's impossible." Peter even took Jesus aside and rebuked him, saying, "Lord, how can you be put to death? You're the Son of God. How could that happen?" And Jesus said to Peter, "Start setting your mind on God's interests and not on man's. Change your vision. Because with God, all things are possible." Following the Lord fully not only requires vision, but number two, it requires devotion. A devotion that is not to people, but to God. In Numbers chapter 1 and verse 27, we learned that the number of men in the tribe of Judah were 74,600. Now remember, they were charged with find one man who's going to be your representative and go into the land. And so there were 74,600 applicants, and we're going to take one. Now if you were applying for a job and you found out those were your odds, would you wait by the phone to get the call said, "You're the one"? Melissa and I used to get reports from our children about everyone who was older than us who had better phones than we did. Because for a long time, I just used my flip phone. It did what I needed, and so I was satisfied with my flip phone. Well, I took my phone out, and I was going to do the math on these odds. I wanted to know, try to put that in a perspective that we could grasp. What is 1 divided by 74,600? So I put that into my flip phone, hit equal, and it said out of range. And that's the point, isn't it? That's how spiritual Caleb was. That when they said choose one man, they said Caleb the son of Jephunneh. He's going to represent the tribe of Judah. But you know what that also means? Same kind of man was chosen from Reuben, Simeon, from Gad, Naphtali, Asher. All of them. They're called chieftains or leaders of their tribe. When Caleb was taking his stand against the majority, those other 10 spies, he was not speaking out against the riffraff of Israel. the unfaithful, the immoral. He was taking his stand against fellow leaders. You think if you were outnumbered 5-1, maybe you wouldn't be tempted to change your story. I'll just be quiet. I won't say anything. But that didn't matter to Caleb. He didn't matter what they thought of him because his devotion was not to people. His devotion was to God. And he had to speak on his behalf. He had to be God's mouthpiece to follow the Lord fully. You're still in Numbers 14. Look at verse 8. If the Lord is pleased with us, then He will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they shall be our prey. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. You see, when the Lord is with us, they're the ones who look like grasshoppers. They're the ones who are mismatched. You want to know how to follow the Lord fully? Be devoted to Him. And stop concerning yourself with what's everybody else going to think about me. You know, I've kind of found that as a liberating thing about growing older. Caring less and less what people think. Because there was a time in my life when that paralyzed me with fear to wonder, what are they saying behind my back? What are they thinking about what I'm wearing? What are they thinking about where I go to church? And now at 45 years old, I'll go check the mail wearing my Crocs and black socks. I don't care. You devoted to people or to God? You remember when they had arrested Jesus and all the disciples fled? And Matthew 26 tells us that Jesus was being led away. And it said that Peter, in verse 58, followed at a distance. You ever tried to do that? I don't want people to think I'm with Him, but neither do I want to let Him out of my sight. I'm still curious enough to want to know what's happening, but if I ever get called into question, I can just say, oh, I'm not one of those. You going to follow at a distance? You're going to follow the Lord fully. Sometimes that will require that you stand up on your own, by yourself. Paul said, I had to do that, but the Lord stood with me. And then sometimes you're going to have to make a stand, not against the world, not against the immorality and ungodliness of our culture. Sometimes you're going to have to take a stand among the leaders and your own family and say within the walls of your house, we shouldn't be watching this. We shouldn't be talking about this. That's gossip. Sometimes you may have to stand up in an assembly like this. Say, we don't have authority for that. We don't have book, chapter, and verse for this. Following the Lord fully requires devotion. To stand up, to speak. You ready to follow Him who followed the Lord fully? Or is it easier for you to follow at a distance? Caleb followed the Lord fully. And then number 3, to follow the Lord fully involves vision, devotion, and completion. That's what fully means, doesn't it? To bring it to its finish. To complete that which you started. To fully realize it all the way to the end. Because of their lack of faith, Israel was made to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. That was 1 year for every day that the spies were in the land. And during this 40 years, that whole generation who followed the 10 spies and did not believe God, they were made to die in the wilderness. And he said there are only 2 from that generation who will be allowed to enter: Joshua and Caleb. And so think about that. For 40 years, you have to wander in the wilderness, in the desert, because of the faithlessness of another people. And then 5 years later, after conquering the land, this 40-year-old man, when he started, is now 85. And where most people would say, I've done my part, I've suffered long enough, I was faithful at the start, it's your turn. You go and serve. You go and fight. Came time after the conquest, they're going to divide out the land and apportion it to the 12 tribes. And so they said, we need a representative of each tribe. So the people of Judah huddled together, and guess who they chose as their representative? Caleb, the son of Jephunneh. They ran him back out there. 85-year-old man. And he comes up to Joshua, and remember, we read these words he said back in Joshua 14. As an 85-year-old man, what's he want to do? Verse 10 of Joshua 14. And now, behold, the Lord has let me live, just as He spoke, these 45 years, from the time the Lord spoke this word to Moses, when Israel walked in the wilderness. And now, behold, I am 85 years old today. I am still as strong today as I was in the day Moses sent me. As my strength was then, so my strength is now for war and for going out and coming in. Caleb was not looking for a place to grow a garden and lay in a hammock. He said, I'm ready to go do what we were supposed to do 45 years ago. When my friends and I were playing football growing up, we would come to the line of scrimmage on defense, and we'd always say, somebody on the team would say, man up. And that means you look across the line of scrimmage and you pick somebody on offense that you think you can keep up with and guard them. I'd always pick the girl with the broken arm down here. I said, I got her. Joshua said to those leaders, man up, who do you want? And Caleb, the 85-year-old, said, I got the giants. They're mine. Should have took them out 45 years ago. We're going to go get them now, and the Lord's going to bring about the victory today. Look at it. Now then, verse 12, give me this hill country about which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day that Anakim were there with great fortified cities. Perhaps the Lord will be with us, and I shall drive them out as the Lord has spoken. Look at chapter 15, verse 14. And Caleb drove out from there the 3 sons of Anak, Shishai and Ahiman and Talmai, the children of Anak. Completion. What good does it do to begin the race when we don't finish? What good does it do to start fighting the good fight if we don't win the war? Following the Lord fully is bringing it all the way to the finish. Think about how many old directories that you can look at. And yes, we can rejoice with those who are not here anymore because they've gone on to their reward. But what about those who aren't with us anymore because they've left the army? And they're no longer fighting with the Lord, they're fighting against Him. They didn't finish fully. They didn't follow fully. We are still at war. There is ungodliness and worldliness that needs to be driven out. Follow the Lord fully. When Paul wrote what is likely his last epistle in 2 Timothy chapter 4, what did he say to the young preacher about his journey as a Christian? He said, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. And he said in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 7, I have fought the good fight. He did not say, I went undefeated. I never lost one battle. He didn't say that. I have fought the good fight. And times I was defeated, I got up, and with the Lord's strength, I kept fighting. I got back in the battle. He said, I have finished the course. He didn't say, not once did I ever get off track. Not once did I ever turn to the right or to the left. I may have swerved some, but I got back on the path and I finished it. And I have kept the faith. He did not say, I never entertained any doubts. My faith never wavered. But he kept returning to what he did know and trusted in God the things he didn't understand. And I have kept the faith unto the end. And for that reason, the crown of life is laid up for me and to all who have loved His appearing. This crown is promised not to those who are faithful when it's convenient, not to those who are faithful when you feel like it, faithful until death. And we too can reach the land promised to those who are faithful. Follow the Lord fully. That takes completion. An understanding that we are not there yet. No one has ever called me by my real name. Bubba is not on my birth certificate. It's Gerald Edward Garner. And I never thought that fit who I was. And you said, well, Bubba doesn't either. And that's right, too. But I always hated the first day of school when the teacher's going through the roll. And she'd say, now, you tell me if you go by a different name than what I have on here. And I dreaded it because every year it was the same. She'd call out Gerald Garner, and I'd raise my hand and say Bubba, and everybody would laugh. But you know, there's coming a day when the roll is called that it won't matter to me what name's on it. I don't care if God should say, well done, Gerald, or well done, Bubba. I just want him to know my name. I want him to know who I am. You've been faithful with a few things. Come, inherit the joy of your master. Because do you know what the alternative is? Depart. I never knew you. You ready to follow him who followed the Lord fully? Then come say his name tonight. I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. I'm ready to follow him all the days of my life. By confessing your faith and repenting of your sins, you can be baptized tonight and begin your new life, a life of service to your King. And after our years of camping and wandering in this wilderness, we can cross over the Jordan and inherit the land God's prepared for us. You ready to get started tonight? Let it be known while we stand and while we sing.